Today, it is our great honor to feature Dr. Laura Bridgewater. Dr. Bridgewater received her bachelor's degree in microbiology from Brigham Young University and her PhD in genetics from George Washington University. In 1999, she joined the faculty here at BYU in the department that's now called Microbiology and Molecular Biology. Or did I get it wrong? Is that right? Microbiology and Molecular Biology, that's right, okay. And she became chair of that department in 2011. Dr. Bridgewater is a devoted teacher and a very talented researcher. Her research has focused on better understanding various health disorders through studying biological processes like the regulation of cartilage gene expression and the effects of stress on the gut microbiota. Dr. Bridgewater served as Associate Dean for the College of Life Sciences before being appointed as Associate Academic Vice President over faculty in August of 2018. Laura and her husband, Tim, who is here, have 4 children and 2 grandchildren. So we know she's been doing a heck of a lot more than just teaching and administration work. In her current position as Associate Academic Vice President, Dr. Bridgewater oversees all aspects of the university rank and advancement process and has oversight over many very important faculty-related committees and councils. She also oversees the Harold B. Lee Library, and so by extension, the Education in Zion Gallery, which is part of the Lee Library. And they are co-sponsors, as I said, of today's presentation. She also oversees the Faculty Center where I work, and we, of course, are the other co-sponsor, but I do want to reassure you that she did not encourage either of us to select her as a presenter today. It was kind of the opposite. I'm so grateful she agreed. In my work as part of the Faculty Center, it's been really a pleasure and a delight to work alongside Dr. Bridgewater and to witness up close her dedication, her care, and her inspired work. I can't tell you how many times I've just sat back amazed at the many instances where I can see her sensitivity, her creativity, and her thoughtfulness in her work. It is a pleasure, a real pleasure to work with Dr. Bridgewater. She really puts a lot into her work. Again, thank you all for coming.
Great to see you all. Thank you for being here today. I want to start with a short introduction of myself because most of you don't know me that well. I'm a scientist. I taught molecular biology and conducted research for my first 19 years at BYU. And then for the last 4 years, I've been working in the central administration. I love to read and I love to learn. One of my favorite scriptures is Doctrine and Covenants, section 88, verses 77 through 80, because it validates my love of learning. It talks about all the things we should learn about and why. Actually, hold that one. Here's what it says. And I give unto you a commandment that you shall teach one another the doctrine of the kingdom. Teach ye diligently that you may be instructed more perfectly in theory, in principle, in doctrine, in the law of the gospel, in all things that pertain unto the kingdom of God. Now, listen to what comes next. Doesn't this sound like what we do here at BYU? Of things both in heaven, there's astronomy, and in the earth, I think that's molecular biology. And under the earth, geology, paleontology, things which have been, there's history, things which are current world events, sociology, things which must shortly come to pass, economics. I won't keep interrupting myself, but it goes on. Things which are at home, things which are abroad, the wars and perplexities of the nations, and the judgments which are on the land, and a knowledge also of countries and of kingdoms. In other words, we should be learning everything that we can. Then God gives us the reasons he wants us to learn. He says, that ye may be prepared in all things when I shall send you again to magnify the calling whereunto I have called you and the mission with which I have commissioned you. That is so empowering. We each have a calling and a mission that God wants us to accomplish, and he's asked us to prepare ourselves to magnify our calling and our mission by learning. The more we learn, the more prepared we'll be to serve him and his children. I grew up in American Fork, Utah, the oldest of 6 children born to Lawrence and Carol Clark. I'm right here. My dad was an orthodontist and my mom was a stay-at-home mom. They were and still are strongly grounded in and fully committed to the gospel of Jesus Christ, and they raised me that way. They've served 2 missions, and they served as temple president and matron of the Mount Timpanogos Temple. They taught me and continue to teach me by their excellent example the importance of keeping family first, of serving others, of keeping covenants, and of centering our lives on Jesus Christ. Like many oldest children, I was pretty obedient and didn't cause them too much trouble. I liked school for the most part growing up, and I received good grades, but I wasn't so much involved in the social or the extracurricular side of things because I was a dedicated ballet dancer. I danced for several hours a day, 6 days a week, under the direction of the talented and legendary Jacqueline College, who is the founder and artistic director of Utah Metropolitan Ballet. In fact, I was one of the original members of that ballet company back when it was called Utah Regional Ballet. I danced in the Nutcracker every Christmas season until I was 22. I danced the lead role of Sugar Plum Fairy for 7 of those years. I danced in many other performances. The highlight of them all for me was when I danced the part of Cinderella in the ballet called Cinderella on the Capitol Theater stage. That was a lifelong dream come true for me. I danced with Utah Regional Ballet all through college, retiring just a couple of months before I left Utah for graduate school. Jackie College is a true visionary, and I was so lucky to learn from her. One of the best things she taught me was to value critical feedback. During a ballet class, the instructor usually walks around the room giving corrections to individual dancers. Keep that hip down, bevel your foot, shoulders down, stay with the music. You might think that a dancer would get down about constantly having all the things they're doing wrong pointed out, but in ballet, having those things pointed out means the instructor thinks you're good. It means you have enough potential that you're worth correcting. If they saw you as hopeless, you wouldn't get corrections. My dad always thought it was so funny when, as a little girl, I'd come home from ballet class and say, I got 4 corrections today. He's thinking, so you did 4 things wrong? What's so great about that? But I knew it meant I was doing something right. It meant I had promise. The things I learned from Jackie College about the importance of precision and working hard, excuse me, and most importantly, about treasuring corrections, influenced every other part of my life in profound ways. That training and experience opened doors for me. Now I want to talk about the title of my presentation today. Most of you have heard the saying, when God closes a door, he opens a window. Looking back at my life so far, I feel like God has opened lots of windows for me when I faced opposition, but I don't feel like he's closed that many doors. Instead, my journey has been filled with open doors and open windows. That's the reason for my title. On a few occasions, the doors have been wide open and I was practically on a moving walkway that carried me through. But in the vast majority of cases, I had to make a decision and take some deliberate action to walk through the door. In a few cases, the door was barely cracked open and I had very heavy and I had to heave all my weight against it to squeeze through. There were also windows. In some cases, they were big open windows right in front of me and I just had to step over the windowsill. But other windows felt like they were 6 feet off the ground and tiny, and it took some serious exertion to get through them. In every case, I had to exercise faith by taking action to go through into the unknown. Today, I'm going to tell you about a few of those doors and windows, and more importantly, about how I've come to recognize the many times in my life when God has opened doors and windows for me. That recognition has led to a major change in my outlook on life. I used to see God's role in my life quite differently than I do now. One of the most common existential questions religious people ask is why bad things happen to good people. As a younger adult, I thought I had it figured out. I was, and still am, convinced that God is good. So to explain why a good God would allow bad things to happen to good people, I concluded that God must have set this world in motion, obtained our informed consent as if we were participating in a medical trial, and then stepped away and allowed Earth life to unfold, driven only by the laws of biology, physics, and agency. I can imagine that informed consent presentation. Pretend you can hear pleasant music playing in the background. Earth life is the next step on your path to eternal salvation. Earth life, however, is not for everyone. Side effects may include, but are not limited to, high blood pressure, shortness of breath, headaches, depression, diarrhea, heartburn, bad breath, incontinence, athlete's foot, acne, and gingivitis. Your mortal body may be subject to congenital abnormality, infectious disease, aging, cancer, physical injuries, mental illness, and autoimmune disorders. You will be subject to all the laws of physics, including gravity, inertia, force, and motion. You may experience an abusive parent, unfaithful spouse, resentful child, discrimination, abandonment, poverty, earthquake, hurricane, tsunami, wildfire, and/or war. Evil will be there, and you may be harmed as evil people exercise their agency. Please sign here to indicate that you understand the risks of participation. And off we go. Well, my opinion on that started to change many years ago when I looked back at my journey to that point and began to recognize situations where God had opened doors and windows for me. I could see where things fell into place against the odds and where opportunities came to me that were far beyond anything I deserved or had earned according to any natural law. I saw where he had placed certain people in my path. It became impossible for me to continue believing that God had set things in motion and then just stepped back to let it all unfold. I could see his hand at so many different points in my life. I'm going to tell you about several of those times when God opened doors for me. The reason I want to do this is to get you thinking about your own life. What are the points in your life when things could have gone either way? Where another person was there at just the right moment to change your trajectory, where your path was altered, maybe a little, maybe a lot, in a way that positioned you to make a difference for one or more of God's children. It can be very difficult to detect these things as they're happening. If you listen to my stories and think nothing like that has ever happened to me, I encourage you to look closer. Sometimes it takes some time and distance from an event before it finally comes into focus in a way that we're able to see and recognize God's hand. Being aware of God's hand makes a huge difference in how I experience the twists and turns of life. I am a planner. In fact, some might say I'm a control freak. I make up my mind about what I'm going to do, and I put my head down and work towards it with great determination, refusing to be distracted or to give up. This is one of my strengths, but it's also a weakness. When the visions and the goals I have for myself don't materialize, it feels like the world is caving in. And my life feels like it's a complete disaster and all my work was wasted. But recognizing God's hand in my life in prior years and seeing the way it's led to unexpected good things has made me much more open to the possibility that a diversion from my own life plan might position me to be of use in God's kingdom in a way I never anticipated. I hope as you hear my stories, you'll be prompted to recognize similar experiences in your own life. The first story happened when I was 14. I was at a youth conference, a stake youth conference in American Fork Canyon. We heard a presentation about Joseph Smith, the Restoration, the Book of Mormon, and obtaining our own testimonies. Then we were sent out into the forest alone with our scriptures and journals to pray until we received our own testimony. Some of you who are about my age may have had similar youth conference experiences. Well, as I prayed for testimony, it felt awkward, even contrived, like I was asking again for something I had already received. That's when I realized I did already know the Book of Mormon and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints were true. So I started thinking, what could I pray about? What did I not know? I realized that even though I knew God was there, I wasn't really sure He knew I was here. I wanted to know that. And also, if my mother in heaven really knew me. That's what I prayed for. I prayed for testimony that my heavenly parents knew me. During that prayer, I felt a great love from both a mother and a father. They didn't just know I existed, they knew all about me. They cared about my life here on earth. And I will never forget, and I'll never deny the feelings that filled my heart there in the beautiful Wasatch Mountains that day. That confirmation of God's love for me has shaped the rest of my life and prevented me from ever having a desire to stray from the covenant path. That experience also gave me something else that I've only become aware of in the last year or so, but that I think has unconsciously affected me for decades. I believe that feeling the presence of and love from two heavenly parents at that time protected me in subsequent years from developing feelings of inferiority as a female, even though I have certainly been treated as inferior at times. I never internalized that treatment. I've been blessed with an intrinsic sense of my own worth and of the worth of all God's daughters. And it has empowered me to do things I might not have felt comfortable doing otherwise. That experience was a precious gift, and it has opened multiple doors throughout my life. The next story started in Max Reese's AP biology class at American Fork High School. Mr. Reese was an excellent teacher, and I loved that class. I did well, I aced the AP exam, but it never occurred to me that science could be a career path. It was just a fascinating class. But crossing paths with Max Reese in that AP biology class opened a door for me that I was not even aware of. I enrolled at BYU the next year and declared myself an English major because I didn't know what else to do. My mom had been an English major and I loved reading. And I figured that being an English major meant I would get to curl up by a fire and read all the best books in the world. Well, I found out in my first year that being an English major actually involves an awful lot of writing. And that wasn't what I had in mind. I knew I wanted a different major, but I had no idea what. My only criteria was that I wanted a major where if I got a job in that area, I would not become bored. That was it. I was weirdly afraid of boredom. I was in an honors colloquium course my freshman year that covered all sorts of topics. And near the end of the year, we had a presentation by Dr. Ron Levitt from the Department of Microbiology. He talked about gene therapy. It wasn't a real thing yet, but he talked about how someday soon we would be able to use molecular scissors to cut DNA and remove mutated genes and replace them with good genes to treat diseases. And I was absolutely fascinated. I was so excited too. Here was something challenging that would never bore me. At the end of class that day, I went up and asked him what I would need to major in to do work like that. He told me the closest thing at BYU at that time was microbiology, and I changed my major that day. I would generally recommend that people take a bit more care when choosing a major, but my impulsive approach worked out well for me. I feel like Ron Levitt's lecture and the confidence I felt in changing my major that day was a door that opened right in front of me. About a year later, I met my husband, Tim. The night before, he was heading out to Washington, D.C. to look for a job. We had a few months together, but then he had to move to Washington for his work before I could begin to wrap my head around the idea of marriage. I was only 20. After several months of a long distance relationship, he called to say that this long distance thing just wasn't working out and that we either needed to go our separate ways or I needed to come out to Washington, D.C. during winter semester and do an internship so we could have some more time together and find out if we were right for each other. Now, remember how I said I'm a planner? I choose my path and I stick to it no matter what. This was not in my plan. In fact, gallivanting off to Washington, D.C. was entirely outside my frame of reference. And I had ballet. And yet I heard myself saying, okay, I'll come to D.C. I cannot even express how out of character this was for me. Tim, with his relentless optimism and determination, had already found 3 generous scientists at the National Institutes of Health who were willing to let me come and work in their labs for free. So I read up on those 3 labs and I contacted one of them. Tim's suggestion that I go to Washington, D.C. was a door that opened right there in front of me. But knowing myself at that time, I still can't believe I actually walked through it. Something just felt right about it, and I stepped. I ended up working under Bill Gall in the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, who studied a very rare metabolic disease called cystinosis. He was an MD PhD, and he arranged for me to follow him on rounds with patients and join in seminars with the medical students who were interning at the NIH and work in his research lab. By the way, I was pre-med at this time. At some point after my initial excitement about gene therapy, I looked around and realized that all the smart men in my classes, and it was mostly men, were pre-med. I figured I was as smart as they were, so I should be pre-med too. Dr. Gall really pushed me toward an MD PhD, and if not that, then just the MD. But through my experience with him in the clinic and in the research lab, I learned that I wanted to be a scientist doing research, not a physician. After the internship was over, I came back to BYU and began working in Bob Sigmiller's research lab. I wasn't even majoring in his department, and yet a door opened that allowed me to find him and begin working in his lab. Dr. Sigmiller handed me a research project on cleft palate that I was able to complete successfully. And he walked me through the process of writing my research up and submitting it for peer review. Thanks to his careful mentoring and patient mentoring, I had a first authored publication in an academic journal by the time I graduated from BYU. This is a rare thing for an undergrad, and it had positive repercussions for me for years to come. In 1988, when I had 1 year left at BYU, Tim and I married, which, by the way, has turned out to be the single best decision of my life. We made a deal that he would come back to Utah so I could finish my last year at BYU, and then I would go out to Washington, D.C. so he could continue to pursue his goals in international business. So when the time came for applying to graduate schools, I only applied to Georgetown and George Washington universities. I applied to their master's programs because I thought that's what you do after a bachelor's. I didn't know that you can go directly into a PhD program with a bachelor's degree in science. My plan was to earn a master's degree, then have a few kids, then maybe go back someday and get a PhD. Well, I received a call from the director of the genetics program at George Washington University telling me they wanted to award me their presidential fellowship, the most prestigious graduate fellowship the university offered, but it was only available to PhD students. Would I consider switching to the PhD program? Now think for a minute about the unlikely series of events that led to that offer. I had done an internship at the National Institutes of Health, one of the nation's premier research institutions. My future husband had created that opportunity for me by sheer force of will. And Dr. Bill Gall had accepted me into an internship program that didn't even exist. I also had a first author publication because of the generous mentoring of Dr. Bob Sigmiller. Those 2 things set me apart. But even with those 2 really unlikely experiences on my CV, what were the odds that the director of the genetics program would call and ask if I wanted to apply to the PhD program? Who does that? I'm convinced that God's hand played a role in how that all unfolded. He cracked open a door that I didn't even know was there. It was a hidden door in what looked like a solid wall. There's one more great blessing that happened through me at this time that others see as God's hand in their lives. After I came back from my internship at the NIH, my friend's boyfriend's 2 nieces were diagnosed with cystinosis, the very same rare disease that Bill Gall at the NIH was studying. It's a miracle that they were even diagnosed in Utah because the condition is so rare. There were no options for treatment here at that time, and their lives would have been very short. But because of my internship with Bill Gall, I was able to facilitate their enrollment in a clinical trial with him that extended their lives for decades. What are the odds that I would blunder into an internship with the world's expert on this rare disease that I had never heard of, which my friend's boyfriend's nieces had? Or that I would even hear that they had it? I just can't see that as mere coincidence. Well, as I said, I was offered the fellowship if I would switch my application from the master's to the PhD program. That probably sounds like a no-brainer, but it actually wasn't. We were planning to have kids after I finished my master's degree. And that felt like reasonable timing, but we didn't want to wait 5 more years. I asked for a couple of days to think it over. On the one hand, I had this offer that felt like a gift straight from heaven. But on the other hand, postponing kids for that much longer felt to me like I would be closing a door on myself. We fasted and prayed about it, and we were guided to the decision that I should go ahead and start the PhD program, and we would start having kids. We'd go through both the door and the window. If it didn't work, I could always stop school. We headed out to Washington, D.C., and I started graduate school. By the time I graduated 5 years later, we had 4 wonderful children. I see God's hand in the circumstances that made that possible. In my first year at George Washington University, I joined the lab of Dr. Steve Paterno. Our first child, Chelsea, was born halfway through my second year. Our son, Nate, arrived 17 months later, and our twins, Lily and Brandon, were born 2 years and 4 months after that, 3 days after I defended my dissertation. I had spent 3 months on bed rest and had typed my dissertation in that bed on a new invention we rented called a laptop. I had 4 kids under 4 years old. This wasn't so much a door that opened as a window I crawled through. A very small window, way up high on the wall. And it did feel like I was fighting my way through against all the odds, but I did it. And in hindsight, there were doors that opened and made it possible. Many lab chiefs at that time would have seen those kids as evidence that I just wasn't serious about graduate school. But Steve Paterno tolerated it amazingly well. He was a family man and a religious man, and he never objected to my commitment to have a family. He must have questioned my sanity at times, but he never showed it. He treated me like every other graduate student. I think it was divine intervention that landed me in his lab of all the labs I could have joined. After I finished graduate school, I was invited to BYU to interview for a job as a professor in the Department of Zoology, even though I hadn't even done the required postdoc yet. We all knew I wasn't qualified yet for the position, but I think they just wanted to maintain contact with me. One of the things that happens every time someone interviews for a faculty position at BYU is they have to go to church headquarters for an interview with the general authority. It's very intimidating. It turns out for me, it was also life-changing. I'm not going to tell you who the general authority was because I have not asked his permission to share the story, but I do want to tell you what happened. The interview was a bit like a Temple Recommend interview. He had a list of questions to ask me that lasted about 45 minutes. At the end, he asked me if I had any questions for him. This was January of 1995, and I had 2-month-old twins, a 2-year-old son, and a 3-year-old daughter. I gathered my courage and said, yes, I do. If mothers are supposed to be home with their children, why is BYU even interviewing me? He spent another 45 minutes with me, and those minutes changed my life. Until that point, I had always felt kind of torn. I could see that I had been blessed with talents and that so many doors and windows had been miraculously opened to enable me to attend graduate school. And we had fasted and prayed and felt guided by the Spirit about our decision. But what if those things were all meant as temptations to test my faithfulness? What if the true path of righteousness would be to resist those gifts and opportunities? I didn't think so, but I wasn't absolutely sure. It was confusing and disconcerting. It was as if a little black cloud would follow me around from time to time, just over my shoulder, kind of threatening, like maybe I might be struck by lightning at any moment. This general authority talked to me about so many things. I wish I had it all on tape, but I'll tell you as much as I can remember. He talked about the importance of focusing on and prioritizing the teachings of living prophets. He talked about how the reality of the situation in Utah at that time was that over half of women with children at home were in the workforce, but so many of them were in low-paid jobs because their limited education limited their opportunities. He talked about how many female students at BYU at that time thought their only options were to be a teacher or a nurse, and that they needed role models of the many other options that were available to them. He talked about how working outside the home is certainly not right for every mom, and that he couldn't tell me exactly how to do it successfully, but that it was essential to keep my family as my top priority. But he said, that's the same for men. Fathers who work should make sure their family is their top priority. He finished by giving me his business card and telling me, if any of those men down there ever give you any trouble, you call me. I still have the card, but I've never had to use it. That little black cloud, the cloud that had been following me around, it vanished. And it's never come back. For the first time, I was certain that the path I had chosen not only wasn't wrong, but it was within the covenant path. I was not expected to reject the gifts and talents God gave me in order to prove my faith. I should embrace those gifts. I just had to keep checking day by day that I was still on a good path. I had to work it out as I went, always keeping my family first and frequently checking to see if I needed to make changes to get my priorities back in line. What a difference. I didn't realize how much that little black cloud weighed me down until it was gone. My life was changed from that point forward, and I will be forever grateful to God for putting that gentleman in my path. What a huge gift and blessing. I have no doubt that he was an instrument in God's hands that day. A door had been flung wide open. A few months after I graduated with my PhD, we moved to Houston so Tim could work more closely with his business partner. When the twins were about 10 months old, Dr. Craig Hannes, a member of our stake presidency, who was also a professor at UT Houston, offered me a job as a part-time postdoc in his lab. There's really no such thing as a part-time postdoc. I see that as an opportunity, or I see that opportunity as a gift from heaven. It was more window than door. It took some scrambling to get through it, but it was exactly what I needed at the time. A year later, I began applying for full-time postdoctoral positions at the MD Anderson Cancer Center. I was invited for 3 interviews. The first was with a woman who told me that if I wanted to be a successful scientist, I would need to accept the fact that I would never see my kids. She worked 16 hours a day running her lab. Her mother lived with her to take care of her son, her 4-year-old son, and she only saw him while he was sleeping. Well, that was not what we had in mind when we decided to pursue graduate school and have kids. The second interview was not memorable, but the third one was the charm. Dr. Benoit de Carbruga worked on cartilage collagen genes, which was closely related to the research I published as an undergrad at BYU. It turned out that Benoit was good friends with a member of my graduate committee at George Washington, Dr. Ajit Kumar. Benoit called him for a reference, and Ajit gave a glowing recommendation. A few days later, Benoit called our house to offer me a job. Unfortunately, our 3-year-old son, Nate, answered the downstairs landline at the same time I answered upstairs. He heard a male voice and concluded that it was his dad, never mind the pronounced Belgian accent. He started shouting into the phone, "Hi, Daddy, hi, Daddy, hi, Daddy." Benoit was trying to offer me a job. Nate was shouting over him every time he tried to say something, and I was trying desperately to get Nate to hang up from the opposite end of the house. What a nightmare. I thought for sure Benoit would change his mind before extending the offer, but he didn't. He offered me the job and I started working full-time. Our 4 children started attending a Montessori school. It was a preschool directed by a woman we called Miss Nashaba. It was a wonderful school, a place that we felt good about sending them and where they started learning so much. I went to work early in the morning and Tim made breakfast, got the kids ready and dropped them off at school. I picked them up at 5:30. The hours I worked were much less than was typical for a postdoc. Most of the other postdocs in the lab worked until 9 or 10 every night and on weekends. I never worked on weekends and I left at 5 o'clock every day to pick up our kids. I received a great blessing though that helped make up for my shorter work hours. Benoit had so much grant funding that his postdocs didn't have to apply for their own grants. But I spent my first several weeks in his lab writing and submitting grant proposals anyway. I submitted about 10 of them to the NIH, the NSF, and several private foundations. A postdoc down the hall from me asked where I was submitting them all, and I mentioned the Damon Runyon Cancer Research Foundation in my list. He said, you have to be in a Nobel Prize winner's lab to get that one. Well, guess which one I got? Yep, the Damon Runyon Fellowship. It paid my salary for 3 years. Getting that fellowship made all the difference for me. Because it was so prestigious, it was much harder for people to fault me or disdain me for the shorter hours I worked. I worked as hard as I could in the short hours I had, and my approach was as effective as anyone else's. The thing is, I didn't deserve that fellowship. There were many others less prestigious that I applied for and didn't receive. The opportunity to apply for grants was a window, and I scrambled through it by submitting all those applications when I didn't have to. I consider that fellowship a blessing straight from heaven that made it possible for me to continue on my path in science while we were also raising 4 extraordinary children. After I'd worked in Benoit's lab at the MD Anderson Cancer Center for a few years, another position came open in the Department of Zoology at BYU. Again, I applied, and again, I was invited to interview. By this time, though, I really didn't see myself working at BYU. I had pictured myself working at a big research institution where I would teach medical students for a couple of weeks each year and spend the rest of my time leading a team of scientists doing research on cancer or some other terrible disease. While interviewing, though, I found myself more impressed with BYU than I had expected to be. In the evening of my first day of interviews, I went to the Mount Timpanogos Temple in hopes of getting some clarity of mind. While I was in the chapel waiting for the session, I picked up a triple combination from the rack in front of me and let it fall open. It opened to Doctrine and Covenants, section 82, and my eyes went directly to verse 3. For of him unto whom much is given, much is required. My mind flashed immediately to all the doors and windows that had been opened for me during the course of my graduate and postgraduate training. Funding at key points, advisors and mentors who were placed in my path at just the right time, a champion of a husband, my wonderful kids who thought their unconventional mom was just fine. I understood then with the force of pure revelation that the purpose of all those blessings was not so that I could become a scientist at a big research institution. It was so I could come to BYU. I did come to BYU and I've been here ever since 1999. There continued to be times where I see God's hand guiding my life, but I don't have time to share too many more. The ones I've shared so far all seem incredibly wonderful, especially in hindsight. But lest you think it's all been sunshine and roses, I want to share one last experience that was really difficult for me when it felt like a door was shut, but that I still see as evidence of God's hand in my life. In my first years at BYU, I was quite successful at getting external grants from the NIH to fund my work. I had R03, R01, and R15 grants that supported the research in my lab. But at about the time I became eligible to apply for rank advancement to full professor, my current grant was ending and I didn't have another one in place yet. I didn't want to apply for rank advancement until my next grant was in place. I realize now that was misguided given the rank and status expectations of my department in college, but at the time it made sense to me. Well, my situation did not improve. I had made a major shift in my research focus And not only was I striking out on grant funding, my pace of publications had slowed down. It's possible this slowing also had something to do with the fact that we now had 4 very active teenagers. In any given week, we'd have a couple of AAU basketball games, at least 2 football or junior jazz games, practices for every team on the days there weren't games, and ballet lessons and rehearsals 6 days a week. Managing the many demands on my time was becoming increasingly difficult. Anyway, about 2 years after I could have applied for rank advancement but didn't, the dean of our college, Dr. Rodney Brown, approached me about whether I would be willing to serve as a department chair. We were both concerned about how being chair would affect my research and therefore my ability to achieve rank advancement to full professor. But I was also intrigued at the opportunity to learn and develop new leadership skills. So I worked out an agreement with the dean. At BYU, department chairs are typically appointed for a term of 3 years. At the end of that time, a review is done, and if things are going well, they're usually reappointed for a second term. I agreed to serve as chair for a first 3-year term and to submit my application for advancement to full professor at the same time. If my application was successful, that would mean my concerns were unfounded, and I would serve a second term as chair if asked. But if my application was unsuccessful, I would finish out my first 3-year term and then take a professional development leave to focus on my research so I could apply successfully for rank advancement. Well, my application was unsuccessful. The recommendation at the department level was negative, and I withdrew the application. This wasn't a big surprise. I knew my application wasn't very strong, and I had no hard feelings towards those who made the tough decision. They gave me exactly the information I needed to map my path forward. I would finish my 3-year term as chair, bring my scholarship back up to snuff through a professional development leave, and reapply for rank advancement. Simple. What I had not foreseen, though, was the way my failure to get rank advancement would impact me. Having my closest peers tell me I wasn't good enough really knocked me over in a way I had not anticipated. Those were a couple of very tough years, and I ultimately sought professional counseling to help me regain my balance and perspective enough to see the situation as more than just a door slammed shut. But my personal reaction aside, a window did open, and the plan worked out. After completing my 3-year term as chair, my husband and I took a group of BYU students to China for study abroad. I then worked in a research lab in China for several more months, published 6 papers that year, and with my newly strengthened portfolio, applied successfully for rank advancement. Within a few days of receiving word of my advancement to full professor, the current dean of life sciences, Jim Porter, asked me to become one of his associate deans. You'd think I would have learned my lesson about accepting administrative assignments, but I said yes. And I really enjoyed working with Jim and the other associate deans. Serving there allowed me to do things that made life better for students and faculty on a larger scale. It felt like what I was doing mattered. I was the first woman to serve as an associate dean in the College of Life Sciences, and that also felt to me like it mattered. A couple of years after that, Academic Vice President Jim Rasband invited me to become one of his associate academic vice presidents. Again, I said yes, becoming the first woman to serve as an associate academic vice president at BYU. For the past 4 years, I've spent my days in meetings and phone calls rather than in the classroom and lab, but I do enjoy it. I enjoy the new things I'm learning, the people I work with, and the opportunity to develop skills and talents that would never have emerged if I hadn't accepted the assignment. I've been able to contribute in ways that were not possible from within my department or college. And I've been able to learn so much from the extraordinarily wise and insightful people around me with whom I would not otherwise have crossed paths. While there's not an obvious moment in this most recent series of events where I feel like God reached in and tipped a scale one way or the other, I do feel like his influence is woven throughout. I wouldn't blame him for me not getting rank advancement the first time I applied, but there are things I learned through that painful process that have been a great help to me in fulfilling subsequent responsibilities. The door that shut and the window that I then crawled through led me to things I needed to learn. In conclusion, I want to make it clear, I'm not suggesting that God directs every detail of our lives, or that we don't have free will, or that there's only one correct path for our lives. I don't believe that is his plan. Rather, I think the shape our lives take is governed by a combination of the unique gifts we've brought into this world, the choices we make regarding how to develop them, and multiple small touches of God's hand to open doors or windows to paths that we wouldn't otherwise have considered. I'm convinced that the main reason God opens doors and windows for us is to position us so that we can make a difference for good in the lives of others. It takes faith to walk through a door or climb through a window. God doesn't push us through. There's uncertainty and there is risk. The lectures on faith teach that faith is a principle of power. Faith is the principle of power by which the worlds were framed, and the principle by which Jehovah works. When we exercise faith by taking action to walk through a door or climb through a window God has opened, our power grows and our faith grows. We expand our power by choosing which gifts and talents we want to develop and by acting on those choices. As we do so, we become ever more able to magnify the callings whereunto God has called us and the missions with which He's commissioned us. I bear testimony that if we're interested in doing good in the world and we're willing to work hard on developing our God-given gifts, God will open doors and windows that put us in places where He can use those gifts to make a difference for good. This perspective on life leaves me still without a good answer to the age-old question of why God lets bad things happen to good people. But I can say with great confidence that it's not because He isn't involved. He is involved in the details of our lives. He knows us personally and cares about each one of us. I bear testimony of that, and I do so in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Amen.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. We do have just a few minutes. Any comments or questions? I can get us started off here. We talked about the open windows and open doors in your life, and also some tough challenges too. What would you say to a person who feels like all they experience is closed doors and closed windows? At least that's what they're experiencing now.
I have seen how long it can sometimes take to recognize an open door as something that opened. I mean, when I first started looking through my life with this perspective, you know, saying, oh, where has God reached in and made a difference for me? I was excited to see the many places, but I also, it looked to me like it had stopped about 10 years before. And I thought, you know, did He just lose interest in me? I don't think so. You know, that doesn't seem right. I realized it's because the closer I was to the situation, the harder it was to see. I feel like when we're in it, it's really difficult. But I also, because of that, decided I want to develop the ability to see this sooner. I don't want to have to wait 10 years to recognize a door just opened for me. I want to be able to see it in real time if possible. And if not that, then soon after. So if someone's feeling that way, I'll bet doors are opening and they're in that stage where it isn't really feeling that way. But just keep looking, keep watching. And with more distance, I think those experiences come into focus. Yes.
Do you hope to go back to teaching, or do you think you'll stay somewhat of a ministerial your time here?
I don't know. I would love to go back to teaching. I do miss teaching. It's been, I think, 4 years since I was in front of a class, and I really do miss teaching, but I don't know what's ahead. So I'm just trying to stay open. We'll see. Oh, yes.
What did you
Well, I mentioned the critical feedback piece. That was huge for me to appreciate corrections instead of feel, driven down or weighed down by them. But there were other things, the work. You can't just do ballet casually. Now, if you are in classical ballet, it really is every day. I mean, it was every day but Sunday for me. So 6 days a week, and you put in the hours. If you don't, if you miss class for a week, the formula we used was it takes 3 times as long to get back where you left off. So it was a culture of really hard work and just being devoted to it. But I learned that when we work, I don't think ballet is the only thing like that. When you work hard at something, you get better at it. And that's a powerful lesson. I may not have been the most talented dancer in the world, but still working hard, I got better. And I may not be the most, talented teacher in the world, but if I work on it, I can get better. It really applies in so many areas of life. Yes. Yes, it depends what you mean by following my footsteps. None of them are in science. They are scattered around the country right now, so none of them are in this room. But they have turned out to be just amazing people who they're all pursuing their different paths. And it's just so fun to see them. Nobody's following in my path, but maybe they're following in my path in that they are following their own path, like I followed my own path. And I love to see that. Yes.
You guys were making most of your time with your kids when you see them.
Focusing on them. I think one of the hardest things is when you're tired. And I spent a lot of years tired. And to me, that was the hardest thing, to not let them see the tired, not let them feel that. I don't know how you do it. How do you not be tired? I don't have that figured out, but I did find that I could not let them see it. If I was conscientious about it, to just really focus on them and not be distracted and not just say, I'm too tired to engage. That's a great point. Special times. My husband just whispered, we used to do this thing where we had we made a wheel with an arrow and it pointed to whose turn it was for what special time. And each of us would, had the wheel and we just spun it, and whichever kid, we didn't spin. I mean, we went in order, whose turn it was for a special time. And it might be walking or, roller skating down to the gas station to buy some candy. Or, maybe something bigger in the car, or, occasionally Tim would take kids on business trips to Washington, D.C. with him. So there was a range of in the special times. They didn't seem to care, they walk to the gas station was as good as anything else. Just having that time mattered a lot to them. Yes.
Tell them how you involved them in your work, the DNA project.
This is my sweet mom here, Carol. She suggested mentioning how I involved them. My kids actually pretty much grew up in my lab at BYU. They were on campus a lot. They used to put the gloves on their heads with the fingers. They'd blow them up and put them on their heads and run around with these things and play with the vortex and the magnetic stir bars and the parafilm. They'd go up and down the hall on the wheeled chairs in the lab, and they just, they were part of it. In fact, I wish I had the picture with me. When our twins were about 8, they were asked in school to draw a picture of a scientist, and my daughter Lily drew a picture of me, and it was me, my hair, my white lab coat, and she had drawn the autoclave with the round handle on it, and the one that she labeled dry ice freezer, that was the -80-degree freezer. And she had a hot plate and a beaker on it and a stir bar in it. And the little boy next to her said, "That's not a scientist." She said, oh, yes, that is. That's my mom. I loved that. I still have the picture. I have it framed now. They had a unique childhood, but I think it was good for them. Mario.
What advice would you give to young mothers who are trying to balance work and kids, who are receiving criticism from loved ones, whether it be parents, siblings, possibly church leaders, their peers? Because I know that a lot of them go through that.
Yep, that is a great question. That when you have that little cloud I described, where you're already feeling like, oh, am I okay or not? Any little thing someone says just sinks into your heart. And you're so vulnerable to criticism. But if you can pray and get that confirmation from God that this path is good, then those kind of things just run off like water off a duck's back. It makes all the difference. So for those who are facing that, I would really encourage doing the work it takes to get to the point where you can say, this path is good. I am not doing a wrong thing by doing this. This is a path for me. Here's how I'm doing it. And just having that confidence makes all the difference.
What recommendations do you have for those who criticize women on campus? What can we do as a campus community to stop some of that criticism against women in academia?
Stop doing it? I don't know. Yeah, just say no. Stop it somehow. I don't know. The thing is, we can't control other people. That's why, Mario's question, I think the answer has to be for the woman herself. What do you have to do to get to the point where those things don't sink into your heart and make you feel insecure and doubt yourself and question? You've got to have your own assurance that this is a good path. There's just no way we can control other people. So we can teach and help do as much as we can, all of us. But in the end, it really comes back to myself, to each of us. Susan.
You're a great example. It's so precious to hear your story. Thank you. You've been in a position to maybe give us some sense of how are women doing at BYU and professoriate? Are gains being made? Is it easier than it used to be? I came just before. Is it better now for people than it was when we came?
There are more women faculty now. Not a huge jump, but little by little, we're increasing. I don't know. I guess it depends how you define, is it better? And it depends so much on individual experiences too. Like I said, I have that business card from the general authority who said, call me if those men ever give you any trouble. And I am being honest when I said I've never needed it. So in my experience, this has been a really good place for me. I've been surrounded by men who are supportive and just treat me as a colleague. Something like the way I told you, Steve Paterno, my graduate advisor, just treated me like a graduate student. I appreciate that so much. I feel like that's how I've been treated here as a woman. But I know not everyone shares that experience. For me, it's been really good.
Let's thank Dr.